human experiment of the same vein was Pruitt-Igoe, an urban housing project consisting of 33 11-story apartment buildings on St. Louis's lower north side.
These developments are run by the St. Louis Housing Authority. This is a far cry from the crowded, collapsing tenements that many of these people have known. Here in bright new buildings with spacious grounds, they can live with indoor plumbing, electric lights, fresh plastered walls, and the rest of the conveniences that are expected in the 20th century.
First occupied in 1954, the same year as Calhoun began his mouse studies at NIMH, Pruitt-Igoe was supposed to be a shining solution to overcrowding and to replace the dilapidated mess of poor and working-class slums that had taken over most of St. Louis, when half the industrial base moved away after the war. But there were strings attached. All kinds of regulations and restrictions were put on the Pruitt-Igoe residents. The father of the household was not allowed to live with his own family, and they sent welfare workers around to make sure the men weren't in the apartments. The people were put under total control and became hopelessly dependent. In just 2 years, the urban planning social experiment began to fall apart.
Tried for 3 days to get city and housing authority officials to help remedy the plight.
The disaster that fell on Pruitt-Igoe and
The water lines in several of the Pruitt-Igoe apartment buildings broke, and the sewer line is broken.
maintenance crews to board up an estimated 10,000
Raw sewage bubbles out of the ground like a malevolent spring.
breakdown of services.
Clean up the mess. No one ever showed.
We need, first of all, to have this area declared as a disaster area and an emergency area.
We're not no dog, cats, or rats that you can just take us and just put us just anywhere. We want some decent place where we can live.
The sense that the housing project was also an experimental laboratory was literally in the air. It came out decades later that during the 1950s and 60s, Pruitt-Igoe was even the subject of top-secret chemical warfare tests conducted by the U.S. military. In 1972, the Rockefeller Foundation funded a study that's become known as the Mouse Utopia experiment. Something like it was discussed in the film The Matrix when Agent Smith is interrogating Morpheus.
It's a little-known fact. The first Matrix was programmed to be an ideal habitat for humans, all needs provided for, but it failed miserably. Your species rejected the code because you're hardwired for pain and suffering. Entire crops of humans died, and we were forced to reconfigure the system.
Behaviorist John B. Calhoun built a mouse paradise with limitless food, where the mice would have everything that they would need.
Utopian conditions of nutrition, comfort, and housing were provided for a potential population of over 3,000 mice.
In just 2 years, 8 mice turned into 2,200 before they succumbed to a mouse apocalypse.
The use of resources became unequal. Although each living unit was identical in structure and opportunities, more food and water was consumed in some areas.
What Calhoun found was, once the population increased to a certain threshold, even though they technically had everything they needed, those who lived in the highly populated areas would become randomly aggressive, violent, and withdrawn.
Violence became prevalent.
Females rarely carried babies to term, and when they did, they hardly cared for them.
The larger the population, the less care a mother gives to her nest and young.
The younger generations would not even attempt to reproduce, but spent all of their time eating and grooming themselves, and ultimately they grew quite dumb.
Other young mice growing into adulthood exhibited an even different type of behavior. Dr. Calhoun called these individuals the beautiful ones. Their time was devoted solely to grooming, eating, and sleeping. They never involved themselves with others, engaged in sex, nor would they fight. All appeared as a beautiful exhibit of the species, with keen, alert eyes and a healthy, well-kept body. These mice, however, could not cope with unusual stimuli. Though they looked inquisitive, they were, in fact, very stupid.
The study was repeated with rats hooked up to electromagnetic sensors in a multi-level high-rise-like structure, with similar results. Though they technically had everything they needed, they lacked purpose. Calhoun said himself that he saw the fate of his mouse population as a metaphor for the potential fate of man.
July of 1972, the Washington Star newspaper broke the story about the controversial Tuskegee Institute syphilis experiment. For 40 years, from 1932 until 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service, in partnership with Tuskegee, secretly studied the effects of untreated syphilis in African American men in Alabama. 600 black men, 399 with syphilis and 201 without the disease, were induced to participate in the experiment. Nearly all of them were poorly educated, impoverished sharecroppers. In exchange for participating, they were promised free medical exams, hot meals, and a burial stipend. The men with syphilis were not told they were infected and were not treated, even after penicillin was discovered to be an effective cure for the disease in the 1940s. Over the course of the experiment, 128 participants died of syphilis or syphilis-related complications. In 1972, when the paper exposed the details, the experiment was still ongoing. It incited public outrage over the unethical treatment of the participants, which led to the experiment's termination that November. The following year, the NAACP filed suit on behalf of the survivors. The federal government settled the lawsuit for $10 million. It also agreed to provide survivors and their infected family members with free medical services.